Professor Laurence Tribe, one of the foremost constitutional law experts in the country, argues that America's unique structure makes it difficult to dismantle its democratic foundations quickly. To our advantage, we have a network of institutional safeguards ranging from state powers and judicial independence to the press and educators, all of which now must be activated in defense of our democracy. A significant part of this defense will play out at the state level, where governors and state attorneys general are already vowing to stand up to Trump and protect vulnerable populations, including women, the LGBTQ+ community, and immigrants. In California, for example, state officials have been working for months to Trump-proof the state. State prosecutors have proactively written briefs to challenge many of the policies that they expect Donald Trump to pursue. Governor Gavin Newsom on Thursday called for a special session of the California legislature to safeguard California values as the state prepares to raise legal hurdles against the next Trump administration. Here in New York, the governor, Kathy Hochul, the attorney general, Letitia James, announced an initiative to protect New Yorkers' rights under a plan called the Empire State Freedom Initiative. The new measure aims to protect reproductive rights, civil rights, immigrants, the environment, and a potential abuse of power. In addition to state-level resistance, federal judges also retain a degree of independence. Though some judges lean conservative, their interpretations of the law do not always align with an authoritarian agenda, and it's not immediately clear that conservative justices like Amy Coney Barrett will give Donald Trump the free rein he wishes to do as he pleases. But beyond government institutions, which have disappointed us in the past, there is chiefly the role of civil society, we, the people, who will collectively form a crucial bulwark against a key authoritarian weapon, historical revisionism. Strong men rewrite history to justify their abuses of power, and they depend on fear to control their followers. From educators to historians to journalists and activists, we are now called upon to play a critical role in keeping the public informed and preserving historical memory, creating a cultural political resistance to attempts to further erase democratic norms. It can be hard in this moment to see past our immediate despair, and yet our nation's history is defined by resistance to tyranny in its many forms, and history serves to remind us that this fight is far from over. When we come back, I'll be joined by the legendary constitutional scholar Laurence Tribe with much more on what stands between Donald Trump's authoritarianism and our democracy. Joining me now is the esteemed legal scholar Laurence Tribe. He's a professor emeritus at Harvard Law School. He's the author of many important books, including American Constitutional Law and To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Larry, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. I wanted to talk to you, interesting message. You disagree with those who say that all the guardrails are gone under a second Trump term, and you mean this very seriously. You're talking about things that exist within our legal and societal structure. What do you mean?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on, Howie. I think your summary before the break of all of the ways in which civil society, not limited to lawyers, but historians, journalists, all of us have our work cut out for us. It's not over. Of course, many people, me included, feared that Donald Trump's aspirations were authoritarian. There's no doubt that if he could do all kinds of terrible things, things that would be extremely dangerous to the safety of individuals in our society, extremely dangerous to our freedoms, he would do it. But he does not have unlimited power. When I read that the guardrails are now gone, I really wonder where these people have been. The Constitution of the United States is not just a remarkable piece of prose. Unlike the largely empty constitutions that some other countries have had, in which there are paper guarantees against oppression, our Constitution develops an architecture with a history of more than 250 years in which power has been systematically dispersed throughout society. It is not and cannot be concentrated in the hands of one leader. The states themselves have enormous power. We have seen them simply beginning in the last couple of days to flex their muscles. They're not rejecting the outcome of the election. They are not plotting to overturn the transfer of power. What they are doing is reminding people that they are not empty vessels. They have authority. 7 of them just the other day enshrined reproductive rights into their constitutions. There are powers that Congress has to override what states do, but those powers are themselves limited. So there is enormous reservoir of resistance and authority that we need to now activate. And there are hundreds of people, lawyers among them, who are working with state attorneys general, state governors, state lawmakers to make sure that those guardrails are activated. Then there's also federal law, the federal judiciary. Of course, it has turned far right on a number of issues that are of great importance to many of us. But that doesn't mean that core guarantees against arbitrary arrest, punishment without trial, prosecution for expression of points of view, the kinds of things that Donald Trump has said he would like to do to his enemies within, doesn't mean that that just happens overnight. In the intro to this piece, you talked about book censorship, book burning, removing disapproved books from the libraries. None of that happens without pushback, even from a conservative federal judiciary. People don't get persecuted without some reason. Of course, an autocrat would like to do that, but we don't simply assume that he has that power. The fact is that if he were to do what he says he wants to do to Nancy Pelosi or to Adam Schiff, you think the federal courts would say, oh, fine, go ahead, put them on trial for nothing? That's not the way this system works. And we are about to see all of the institutions that preserve the core elements of freedom and democracy activated in a way that we haven't had to see before.
Right,
So
and I think that's the point, right?
Forward to being part of that.
We have not tested. We think we've thrown everything at the wall, but we haven't. And your point is that there are still other tools. We just have not needed to or thought to implement them because we thought there were other guardrails that were going to work. But when those didn't work, we still have more guardrails. Ruth Ben-Ghiat was saying last night in her study of authoritarianism, she was saying that in fact, the beginnings and the end of authoritarian regimes are the place in which bureaucratic and civil society resistance are most effective. If in this moment where you see a guy who says he wants to be an authoritarian, this is the place where the bureaucrats, the states, and as you said, journalists, academics, lawyers, this is the moment in which to say, we're going to try new defense mechanisms.
That's right. And when people try to dismiss all of that by calling it the deep state, by giving it some nasty name, what they're doing is naming the institutions of society that our framers were smart enough not to abandon. If you look back at what they wrote, many of them feared the rise of a demagogue, a charismatic, would-be dictator, and they realized that one can't prevent that kind of thing from developing, especially in a society that evolves in unpredictable ways. But they didn't simply assume that when that happened, we would have to just lie down and play dead. Right. That is, the system they built was a lot stronger than the systems that Italy, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Brazil, a number of other countries have had, where they have lovely sounding constitutions, but not a thick, dense forest of guardrails, if you will, that hold back the ambitions of the powerful who seek to advance their own interests rather than the interests of the people.
What do you think about people who say We thought we had guardrails that we found out were just gentlemen's agreement and that there are no gentlemen left in the room. There are people who are saying, we thought these things were in place, and now you're telling me that we've got other guardrails. How do you convince them that, yes, actually, we have layers and layers of guardrails that we just haven't tested yet?
Well, they'll have to watch, but they'll have to also become actively involved. The fact is, take the infamous immunity ruling. Yes, it is true that Donald Trump can direct his attorney general to do all kinds of criminal things without himself being held criminally responsible. That's one of the bizarre and scary outcomes of the immunity decision. But that doesn't mean that if Donald Trump says to his new attorney general, I want you to go and arrest Congresswoman X in the night and bring her in front of a firing squad, that any federal judge would simply say, oh, that's fine. We've been told that Trump has no limits. No, the fact that he can't be criminally prosecuted doesn't mean that habeas corpus won't be available, doesn't mean that people will not go to the ramparts to protect those who are made the targets of vindictive, unwarranted persecution. And I think hopefully the people around Donald Trump will remind him that that is the reality. And if they don't, he will come up against the hard truth, because this is an area where reality bites.
Larry, thanks for being with us this morning. It is important to get these perspectives because there are a whole lot of people who aren't sure what the future looks like, and they turn to people like you for a bit of a roadmap. So we appreciate that. Lawrence Tribe is a professor emeritus at Harvard Law School. He's the author of many important books, including American Constitutional Law and To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment.